Have you ever found yourself staring at a textbook, reading the same paragraph over and over, and still not understanding what it means? Or maybe you've spent hours highlighting, making notes, and creating flashcards, only to forget everything when it matters most? If you're nodding right now, I want you to pay very close attention to what I'm about to share with you. Think about this for a moment. How much time have you wasted trying to learn things that never truly stuck in your mind? How many opportunities have slipped through your fingers because you couldn't master a skill or subject fast enough? The uncomfortable truth is that in today's rapidly evolving world, the ability to learn quickly isn't just an advantage, it's a necessity for survival. While others are struggling with outdated learning methods, drowning in information but starving for understanding, you could be rapidly mastering any subject you choose. The difference isn't intelligence or talent, it's method. And today, I'm going to reveal the most powerful learning technique ever developed. One that transformed an ordinary student into a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and that can transform you into a learning machine. The Feynman technique. Named after Richard Feynman, one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century, this method is deceptively simple, yet devastatingly effective. It's not about studying harder, it's about studying smarter. And the results? They're nothing short of extraordinary. Before we dive deeper, I want you to consider something critical. According to research from the University of Texas, people forget approximately 90% of what they learn within just 1 month when using conventional study methods. 90%. Think about that. All those hours, all that effort, gone. But the Feynman technique has been shown to increase retention rates to over 80% even months later. The difference is staggering. Look around you. In every field, in every industry, the pace of change is accelerating. What you learned yesterday might be obsolete tomorrow. The average skill now has a shelf life of just 5 years before it needs significant updating. Are you prepared for that reality? Can your current learning approach keep up? For most people, the honest answer is no. The fundamental problem with traditional learning approaches is painfully simple. They create an illusion of knowledge rather than actual understanding. When you passively read, highlight, or listen, your brain tricks you into believing you've mastered the material. You mistake familiarity for comprehension. This false confidence is perhaps the most dangerous learning trap of all, because you don't know what you don't know. Think back to a time when you felt completely prepared for an exam or presentation, only to freeze when the moment came. That gap between what you thought you knew and what you actually understood, that's where the Feynman technique works its magic. It ruthlessly exposes these gaps and then helps you fill them with rock-solid understanding. But the cost of ineffective learning goes far beyond academic or professional setbacks. There's an emotional toll that's rarely discussed. The frustration of putting in hours of study with minimal results. The anxiety of feeling perpetually behind. The blow to your self-confidence when you can't grasp concepts that others seem to understand effortlessly. These feelings can lead to a fixed mindset, the belief that you're just not good at certain subjects, that your learning capacity is somehow limited. Let me be absolutely clear, that belief is completely false. The human brain is capable of learning virtually anything when given the right method. Your struggles aren't due to any inherent limitation. They're the result of using approaches that work against your brain's natural learning mechanisms rather than with them. Now, let's talk about Richard Feynman himself. Born in Queens, New York in 1918, Feynman wasn't born with any special learning abilities. What set him apart was his approach to understanding. While his colleagues at Cornell, Princeton, and Caltech often hid behind complex jargon and mathematical formalism, Feynman had an almost obsessive commitment to clarity and simplicity. This approach led him to revolutionary work in quantum electrodynamics, for which he won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1965. But what's most remarkable about Feynman wasn't his intelligence. It was his extraordinary ability to learn, understand, and explain even the most complex subjects. From quantum physics to biology, from art to safecracking, Feynman could master new fields with remarkable speed. His secret? A four-step process that he developed and refined throughout his life. First, choose a concept and study it. Gather information from various sources and try to learn everything you can about the subject. Second, pretend to teach the concept to a child. Explain it in the simplest language possible, as if you were talking to someone with no background in the subject. Use simple vocabulary and avoid technical terms. Third, identify the gaps in your explanation. When you get stuck or find yourself using complicated language, go back to the source material. This is where the magic happens, where you recognize what you don't fully understand. And fourth, simplify and create analogies. Review and simplify your explanation further until you can convey the idea in its most basic form, using analogies that connect to common experiences. What makes this technique so powerful is that it aligns perfectly with how our brains naturally learn and remember information. Neuroscience research has confirmed what Feynman intuited decades ago, that active recall, teaching, and simplification create stronger, more durable neural connections than passive review ever could. When you attempt to explain a concept in simple terms, you activate multiple regions of your brain simultaneously. You're not just engaging your memory, you're recruiting your language centers, your reasoning faculties, and your creative capacities. This multimodal engagement literally builds new neural pathways, making the information more accessible and more deeply integrated into your existing knowledge network. Research from Washington University in St. Louis has shown that the expectation of teaching material to others increases organization of knowledge and enhances memory, even if the actual teaching never takes place. Just the mental process of preparing to teach dramatically improves learning outcomes. The Feynman technique leverages this teaching expectancy effect to its full potential. But the true power of the Feynman technique goes beyond just retention. It fundamentally transforms how you think. When you habitually break down complex ideas into their simplest components, you develop what cognitive scientists call transfer learning. The ability to apply principles from one domain to solve problems in another. This is precisely what made Feynman so innovative. He could see connections between seemingly unrelated fields because he understood the fundamental principles that united them. Think about what this could mean for you. Imagine being able to pick up any new skill or subject and not just learn it, but truly master it. Imagine the confidence that comes from knowing you can understand anything if you apply the right method. Imagine the professional opportunities, the personal growth, the sheer satisfaction of having a mind that's constantly expanding rather than struggling to keep up. This isn't fantasy. It's entirely possible. I've seen it happen countless times. People who believed they were bad at math, solving complex equations with ease. Language learners becoming conversationally fluent in months rather than years. Professionals rapidly adapting to technological changes that left their peers behind. The common factor? They all applied the principles of the Feynman technique. Let me share a striking example. A study from the University of California followed two groups of medical students learning diagnostic procedures. The control group used traditional study methods, reading, highlighting, and reviewing notes. The experimental group used a Feynman-like approach, explaining concepts in simple terms and identifying gaps in their understanding. 6 months later, the traditional learners had retained about 20% of the material, while the Feynman group retained more than 70%. Even more importantly, the Feynman group could apply their knowledge to new, unusual cases that hadn't been covered in their training. This is the difference between surface knowledge and deep understanding, between temporary memorization and lasting mastery, between struggling to keep up and confidently leading the way. But I can almost hear what you're thinking right now. This sounds great, but I don't have time for a whole new learning approach. My schedule is already packed. I understand this concern, but it's based on a fundamental misconception that effective learning takes more time than ineffective learning. The reality is exactly the opposite. The Feynman technique isn't about adding more study hours to your day. It's about making each minute of study exponentially more productive. Consider this. Research from Cornell University found that students using active recall techniques similar to the Feynman method needed 40% less study time to achieve the same results as those using conventional methods. Over the course of a 4-year degree, that's thousands of hours saved. Time isn't the real issue. The real issue is the sunk cost fallacy, the reluctance to abandon familiar but ineffective methods because you've already invested so much time in them. But ask yourself, would you rather spend another year struggling with approaches that don't work, or invest a few weeks adopting a system that could transform your learning forever? The choice is yours, but the evidence is clear. The Feynman technique isn't just another study tip or learning hack. It's a fundamental reconceptualization of what it means to truly understand something. And once you experience the difference, there's no going back. Now, let's break down exactly how to implement this technique in your own life, step by step. The first step is to select a concept you want to learn. Start with something manageable, not an entire field, but a specific principle, idea, or process within that field. For example, instead of trying to learn economics, focus on supply and demand, or opportunity cost. This focused approach prevents overwhelm and allows for deeper processing. Once you've selected your concept, gather information from multiple sources. Don't rely on just one textbook or video. Research shows that exposure to different explanations of the same concept significantly enhances understanding by highlighting different aspects and applications. Read articles, watch videos, listen to podcasts, immerse yourself in diverse perspectives on the topic. Next comes the most critical step, the one that separates the Feynman technique from all other learning methods. Take out a blank sheet of paper and write the concept name at the top. Then, without referring to your sources, explain the concept as if you were teaching it to a child. Use simple, everyday language. Avoid jargon and technical terms. If the concept is complex, use analogies and examples that connect to common experiences. This process will feel uncomfortable at first. You'll find yourself reaching for technical terms or complex explanations that you've memorized but don't fully understand. Resist this temptation. Force yourself to translate everything into language so simple that a child could follow it. As Einstein purportedly said, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. When you hit points where you struggle to simplify, where your explanation becomes convoluted, or you find yourself thinking, this part is just too technical to simplify, stop. Circle these sections. These are not failures. They're valuable discoveries. You've just identified the exact points where your understanding is incomplete. This is the gold of the Feynman technique, the precise targeting of knowledge gaps. Now return to your source material, but with a completely different focus. You're not trying to reread everything. You're surgically addressing the specific gaps you've identified. This targeted approach is far more efficient than general review. You're not wasting time going over material you already understand. You're zeroing in on exactly what you need to learn. Once you've filled these gaps, return to your explanation. Refine it. Simplify it further. Add analogies and visual examples. Connect it to concepts you already understand well. This isn't just elaboration for its own sake. Research in cognitive psychology shows that creating these connections significantly improves both retention and application. Finally, test your explanation on someone else. This doesn't have to be an actual child, though that can be remarkably effective. It could be a friend with no background in the subject, or even an imaginary audience. The key is to speak out loud, not just review your written explanation. Verbalization activates different neural pathways than writing. strengthening the memory further and often revealing new gaps that weren't apparent on paper. This process seems simple, and in structure it is. But don't confuse simplicity with ease. The Feynman technique is challenging precisely because it forces you to confront what you don't know. It strips away the comfortable illusion of understanding and pushes you toward genuine mastery. This discomfort is a feature, not a bug. It's the feeling of your brain building new neural connections. Let's address some common obstacles you might face when implementing this technique. First, there's the resistance to simplification. Many fields, especially academic and technical ones, train us to value complexity and jargon. There's an unspoken belief that complex language signals sophisticated thinking. But this is precisely backward. As Feynman himself demonstrated throughout his career, the deepest understanding manifests as clarity, not complexity. Then there's the ego barrier. Admitting what you don't know feels vulnerable. Identifying gaps in your understanding can be humbling, especially if you're used to being the smart one, or if you've built your identity around academic or professional expertise. But this vulnerability is precisely what makes the technique so powerful. It requires intellectual honesty, the willingness to prioritize genuine understanding over the appearance of knowledge. Another common challenge is the curse of knowledge. Once you understand something, it becomes difficult to remember what it was like not to understand it. This makes simplification harder than it sounds. The solution: practice imagining you're explaining to different audiences, a child, a friend from a different field, someone from the 19th century. Each imagined audience forces you to reconsider your explanations from fresh perspectives. For truly complex material, you might worry that some concepts simply can't be simplified beyond a certain point. This is partially true. Quantum field theory will never be as simple as explaining how to bake cookies. But the principle still applies. Any concept can be broken down into simpler components than is typically done. When you hit a complexity wall, focus on breaking the concept into smaller parts and simplifying each part individually. Now let's talk about how to supercharge the basic Feynman technique with additional strategies that enhance its effectiveness even further. One powerful extension is combining Feynman with spaced repetition. Instead of completing the process once and moving on, schedule regular reviews of your simplified explanations. Research shows that reviewing information at increasing intervals, 1 day later, 3 days later, 1 week later, 2 weeks later, etc., dramatically improves long-term retention. Digital tools like Anki can automate this scheduling, but even a simple calendar reminder system works well. Another enhancement is to create visual representations of your simplified explanations. Mind maps, diagrams, or even simple sketches activate visual processing regions in your brain, creating additional neural pathways to the information. According to a study from the University of Waterloo, drawing even simple pictures related to concepts improves recall by nearly 30% compared to writing notes. You can also amplify the technique's effectiveness through group learning. Form a Feynman circle with peers who are learning similar material. Take turns explaining concepts to each other using the simplest possible language. The immediate feedback you receive will highlight gaps in understanding that might not be apparent when working alone, and teaching others reinforces your own comprehension. For those who enjoy writing, maintaining a Feynman journal can be transformative. After completing the technique for a new concept, write a dated entry explaining the concept in simple terms. Revisit these entries periodically, updating them as your understanding evolves. This creates a tangible record of your intellectual growth and provides material for future review. Digital tools can also enhance implementation. Voice recording your explanations and listening to them later often reveals linguistic crutches or circular reasoning that isn't apparent while speaking. Video recording goes even further, allowing you to assess your nonverbal cues. Do you look confident explaining certain parts, but hesitant during others. These subtle signals can reveal areas where your understanding is still developing. For technical subjects, coding or building physical models of the concepts forces an even deeper level of understanding. You cannot write an algorithm or build a working model of something you only vaguely comprehend. This learning by building approach was central to Feynman's own development as a physicist. He didn't just understand the mathematics of quantum mechanics, he could visualize and model how particles actually behaved. The beauty of these enhancements is that they can be tailored to your personal learning style. Some people process information best visually, others verbally, others through hands-on application. The core Feynman technique works for everyone, but these customizations allow you to play to your cognitive strengths. As you begin implementing this approach, you'll notice something remarkable happening. The boundaries between different subjects start to blur. Concepts from one field suddenly illuminate problems in another. This is because you're no longer memorizing isolated facts. You're understanding fundamental principles. And principles, unlike facts, are transferable across domains. This cross-disciplinary thinking is increasingly valuable in today's complex world. The most innovative solutions often come from applying ideas from one field to problems in another. By training yourself to understand concepts at their most basic level, you develop this ability to transfer insights across boundaries. Exactly the skill that defined Feynman's genius and that employers increasingly seek. Let's look at some extraordinary examples of the Feynman technique's effectiveness in action. Barbara Oakley, an engineering professor at Oakland University, failed high school math before joining the U.S. Army. During her military service, she decided to retrain her brain to learn mathematics. Using principles similar to the Feynman technique, she not only mastered the subject, but went on to earn a PhD in engineering. She later created one of the world's most popular online courses, Learning How to Learn, based partly on these methods. Or consider Scott Young, who completed MIT's 4-year computer science curriculum in just 12 months through independent study. His primary method? Breaking down complex concepts and explaining them in simple terms, the essence of the Feynman technique. He didn't just pass equivalence of the courses, he developed a deep understanding that allowed him to work on original programming projects. These aren't isolated cases. Research consistently shows that learning methods based on active recall, simplification, and teaching produce far superior results to passive approaches. A meta-analysis of 217 studies involving over 14,000 students found that active learning strategies like those employed in the Feynman technique increased exam performance by an average of 6%, the difference between a B and an A in many grading systems. Even more striking, these methods reduced failure rates by 36%. But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from comparing learning outcomes over time. A study from Purdue University tracked students using different learning methods over a 2-year period. Those using passive techniques like rereading and highlighting showed rapidly diminishing retention, remembering less than 20% of material after 1 year. Students using active techniques maintained retention rates above 60% even 2 years later. The difference wasn't small, it was transformative. Now let's address some common objections you might have. This sounds great for conceptual learning, but what about memorization-heavy subjects like anatomy or vocabulary? The Feynman technique actually excels here too, but with a slight modification. Instead of explaining isolated facts, focus on explaining the systems or patterns that connect them. Don't just memorize muscle names. Explain how the muscular system works together, using simplified language and analogies. This creates a framework that makes individual facts easier to remember because they're connected to a coherent whole. But I've been learning my way for years. Changing now would mean admitting my approach has been inefficient. This is perhaps the most difficult psychological barrier to overcome. The sunk cost fallacy combined with ego protection. Consider it this way. Would you rather continue with methods that limit your potential or experience temporary discomfort that leads to vastly improved capabilities? Learning how to learn effectively is perhaps the highest leverage skill you can develop. It improves everything else you'll ever learn. What about subjects that require practice, like music or sports? The Feynman technique complements physical practice beautifully. By developing clear mental models of proper technique, you practice more effectively. Many top athletic coaches now incorporate explicit verbalization, having athletes explain what they're doing in simple terms, to accelerate skill development. The technique doesn't replace practice. It makes practice more productive. Now, I want you to imagine something. Imagine waking up tomorrow with complete confidence in your ability to learn anything, not just to pass a test or complete an assignment, but to truly understand at a fundamental level. Imagine looking at the rapidly changing landscape of your field, not with anxiety about keeping up, but with excitement about what you'll master next. Imagine the freedom of knowing that no concept, no skill, no body of knowledge is beyond your reach if you approach it with the right method. This isn't a fantasy. It's entirely achievable. The human brain is the product of millions of years of evolution, refined to be the most sophisticated learning machine in known existence. When you work with its natural processes rather than against them, its capacity is astonishing. The Feynman technique isn't a hack or a shortcut. It's alignment with how your brain is designed to learn. The difference between where you are now and where you could be isn't intelligence or talent or some mythical learning gene. It's method, just method. And methods can be changed today, this hour, this minute. So here's my challenge to you. Choose one concept you've been struggling to understand. Something important but difficult. Something you've tried to learn before but never quite grasped. Apply the Feynman technique exactly as I've described it. Experience for yourself the difference between passive familiarity and true understanding. Don't just nod along thinking, this sounds good, I'll try it someday. Commit to it now. Write in the comments, I'm applying the Feynman technique to learn your concept. Make it public. Create accountability. Join the community of people who are transforming how they learn, and by extension, what they can achieve. Remember this, in a world where information doubles every 12 hours, it's not what you know that matters most. It's how quickly and deeply you can learn. The Feynman technique isn't just another study strategy. It's a fundamental shift in how you relate to knowledge, from passive consumption to active creation of understanding. I want to leave you with one final thought. Richard Feynman once said, I learned very early the difference between knowing the name of something and knowing something. This distinction is everything. Most education systems train us to know names, dates, formulas, the surface of knowledge. The Feynman technique trains you to know things, deeply, fundamentally, usefully. The choice is yours. You can continue with learning methods that produce temporary, fragile, surface-level knowledge, or you can adopt an approach that builds deep, durable, transferable understanding. You can struggle to keep up, or you can leap ahead. You can accept the limitations of conventional learning, or you can experience the extraordinary capacity of your mind when it operates at its full potential. The technique is simple. The implementation is straightforward. The results are transformative. All that's required is your decision to begin. So, will you keep learning the same way you always have? Or are you ready to understand anything? If this message has resonated with you, if you feel something has shifted in how you think about learning, then join our community of learners transforming their minds and their lives. Subscribe, activate notifications, and be part of this revolution in learning that's spreading across the world. And don't forget to write this phrase in the comments to show you're committed to transforming how you learn. Today I choose to understand, not just know. Write it down, make it yours, because the moment you do, your relationship with knowledge will never be the same again. Remember, the world belongs to those who truly understand. This is your moment. This is your signal. Take the first step, and I'll see you in the next video.